But we have to still remember that there's a vigorous debate about the state of climate policy. We've seen in the last few years perhaps a waning of the influence of the UNFCCC process, lower and lower levels of optimism in each of the conferences of parties. At the same time as we've seen the expansion and growth and development of regional and continental scale carbon pricing and climate regulatory programs. And that's certainly one of the themes that we're hoping to pick up on today. What we've seen in the EU ETS is, in some ways, the impact of a contraction of the economy there and the cascading effects of that through on carbon pricing. But what we've also seen is increasingly vigorous opposition to price constraints and supply constraints within the emissions trading system. So I think we'll hear from Dirk a little bit today about what some of the longer-term implications of that will be. On a regional scale, many of you who are familiar with North America will know that most of the action is happening at the state and the provincial levels. We've seen the launch of the Air Resources Board initiative, the cap and trade scheme in California, but also a wide range of complementary climate policies associated with driving emissions reductions. So when we talk about complementary policies, we talk about things about low carbon fuel standards, renewable portfolio standards. In some ways, carbon pricing in that context is a backstop to really force change into the policy system. We've seen other states in the US start to show more interest, the Registry system in the Northeast, noises from Washington and Oregon about potentially establishing either a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. And then British Columbia and Alberta, in some ways with the most mature carbon systems and climate policies in North America in terms of their age and vintage. In Alberta, we've seen increasing focus on the quality of the program and expansion of the program. And in British Columbia right now, we have a very vigorous debate, as you heard this morning, with all the optimism about the value of the expansion of LNG production here as a transitional fuel. There's a vigorous debate about how that can be allowed to happen in the context of the long-term climate targets that sit in the legislation here. As we'll hear this morning as well, Mexico, as a partner in some of these initiatives, is moving very quickly towards comprehensive policies. And we start to believe now that there's strong reasons to be optimistic about what's happening in Japan and in China and Korea in terms of some of the embryonic systems that emerge here. One of the big questions I'm going to pose to the panel this afternoon will be, in the context of all of this mosaic of regional change at the sub-state level in many cases, how much do we still need processes like the UNFCCC process? Do we really need to be held hostage to that global negotiation when we've seen so much movement in terms of policy at state, federal, and provincial levels? The second question is going to be, what is the role of some of these transitional fuels, and to some extent, how does climate policy move hand in hand with some of those choices and decisions that are made about the financing of clean technology and support for transitional fuels like LNG and natural gas in general? So with that said, we're going to hand over to Cristina Figueres for a brief introduction, and then I'll ask each of the speakers in turn to spend 5 minutes just presenting from their own perspective, and then we'll open up to Q&A at the end.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, I thank Globe 2014 for inviting me to speak to you as you opened the session on climate adaptation, and I thank Globe for hosting this international forum on business and the environment. We're keenly aware that business and the environment are intrinsically linked. A cursory glance shows that how we grow and develop economically depends on the natural environment, from mining to agriculture to construction to energy. These industries all depend on natural resources. And now, as the population pushes 8 billion, we have a new reality: that the increased strain on natural resources by humanity's recent growth explosion requires a rethink of how we manage and use resources. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the issue of climate change. As more and more evidence and science become available, we must make dramatic changes, or the risks posed by climate change will derail years of progress with untold costs to private and public sectors. The risks from climate change are materializing. The Philippines and the US East Coast are still rebuilding from the latest round of extreme storms. Cities in China and India face air quality issues stemming from rapid expansion. Flood and drought and wildfire and water scarcity, all issues exacerbated by climate change, affect communities worldwide, from vulnerable developing countries to megacities in the developed world. And we are waking up to the fact that these climate-related issues are also economic issues. Rebuilding from storms is expensive and lowers economic productivity. Extreme carbon pollution can stop a city in its tracks, keeping people inside and closing airports while passing health costs to citizens. Water is essential to agriculture, energy, and manufacturing processes. Too little of it is a crisis, and too much of it can swamp systems, services, and supply chains. We face an immense challenge. To meet this challenge, all groups must take action to mitigate causes of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, and inefficiency, and action to adapt to the climatic changes we know are coming. For every company, like every country and every community, action to adapt is different. I cannot tell you specifically how your enterprise should act on climate, but I can tell you that you should. And others I have spoken with already are acting in ways that make sense for them. Insurers are figuring climate risk into valuation metrics. Investors are looking at green bonds and renewables to avoid exposure to stranded assets. Large footprint retail is investing in solar and other renewables to stabilize energy costs over the long term. Key industries are moving their operations to safer locations. Efficiency improvements, green and safer facilities, and innovative technology turn action on climate into lower overhead costs, increased stability in volatile markets, and improved customer relations. Today, I ask you that you do two things. First, I ask you to join these leaders, if you haven't already. Look at how climate change will affect your supply chains, your clientele, and all parts of your industry's business model, and be transparent about it. There will be impacts that you need to know about and your investors need to know about. And you improve your reputation by recognizing potential pitfalls and transparently disclosing steps to address these concerns. Secondly, I ask you to support action by governments to address climate change, whether on the subnational, national, or international level. Civil servants and elected officials working hard to meet their constituents' needs face a governance challenge as climate impacts materialize. Their work is made easier when increasing numbers of private sector actors advocate for an international regulatory framework that bends the emissions curve and recoups the costs of carbon-intensive development. The sooner that framework is in place, the sooner we set a stable foundation for low-carbon global economic growth, sustained over generations, not just over business cycles. This is why delay is not an option. The international process is at a pivotal moment, looking at mitigation and adaptation in the post-2020 period. We have a great opportunity here. This is the opportunity for governments to evaluate their growth needs and how those needs can be met in low-carbon ways that protect the value of natural resources. This is the opportunity to hasten the transition to low carbon and set a sustainable development agenda that serves people and creates prosperity as we respect planetary boundaries. Growth today doesn't make sense if it closes a door on stability tomorrow. If we grow smarter, grow greener, we pass a legacy to the next generations. We pass on a legacy we can be proud of, a low-carbon, sustainable growth model that meets the needs of billions of people well into the future. Thank you, and I wish you a productive conference.
I assume we don't clap for someone when they're not. So Janet, I'd like to start with you, and as we discussed in advance of this event, you really have, I think, can help us understand what we've learned more recently in terms of impacts of climate change and how that is beginning to influence the world of policy. So perhaps hand it over to you to help us understand, particularly in a year where we've seen unusual weather changes and the strengthening debate about the impacts on a range of different geographies. Perhaps you can help set the context for us.
Oh, thank you for that. And I think, Christiana actually started that conversation off in a good direction, because economic damages from extreme weather events have climbed to really near record levels, in especially 2012, where we have the full year of data. In 2012, we had more than 800 extreme weather events that resulted in, more than $130 billion worth of damages. And Munich Re, the big reinsurer, actually says that 2012 was third in terms of the costliest years, behind 2005 and 2011. And while we don't have similar numbers, for the whole year of 2013, we do know that there were a series of really devastating impacts. The Central European floods, numbers around there are $22 billion worth of damages. Super Typhoon Haiyan, 1.3 million structures that were damaged, $13 billion, and thousands of fatalities. And let's not forget what went on in Alberta. I just sat in a session previous to this, because I've been looking for what were the costs of those devastating floods. And the number of people we're putting out on the panel ranged from 1.3 billion to 6 billion. It's pretty huge. I mean, the pictures, having lived in Calgary for a long time, I was quite shocked to see water running down 4th Avenue. And then there's California, the drought in California. This is a record drought. Snowpack, about 25% of normal end of February. And the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says that it's the driest year, and it's 119-year record for California. Drought in California, of course, that affects agriculture. It affects electricity generation. There are extreme costs to go with that. Now, of course, we can't say that any of these events are caused by climate change. We can't. The science isn't good enough. But what we can say are these events actually demonstrate our vulnerability. We can also say that climate change is magnifying the risk profile for these extreme weather events. And we can say that there is definitely a role that climate change is playing with respect to these events. And I don't think anybody probably in this audience is surprised that there's an increasing focus on resilience. In President Obama's climate plan that he put out last June, there's actually 3 pillars. One is mitigation. He's working on having the Environmental Protection Agency work on regs for the power plants, changing the fuel economy standards for heavy and medium vehicles. But his 3rd pillar is on resilience. And he's been convening state, local, and tribal leaders in a task force. He's got an interagency council to give him advice on policies that are barriers to improved resilience. And just last week, he put out announced a big data initiative, because understanding what the data is, what the risks are, and how that's changing is really critical to being able to assess those risks. And we at C2ES, we used to be the Pew Center, and many people probably know us by that name better. We spent years talking about the right policy for mitigation. And increasingly, we're spending a lot of time on resilience. We put out a report last summer looking at what are companies saying and doing publicly on this issue. And, 9 out of 10 of the S&P Global 100 index companies, 90%, say that climate and extreme weather is a current or near-term business risk. And 62% of them say that they've already experienced or expect to experience in the next decade climate or weather-related impact. It's pretty big. Now, of course, I don't think we should just throw up our hands and just do adaptation. That just doesn't make any sense. I think it's prudent to continue to look for policies, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because the more we can mitigate or reduce our emissions, the better chance of success our adaptation efforts are actually going to have. So it's not an either or. It's not adaptation or mitigation. It's both. So again, Christiana had a great way of ending this. Really, delay is not an option. We need to be doing both of these things now.
Dirk, you, for those of you who don't know International Emissions Trading Association, it's incredible reach and influence and convenes some of the most thoughtful and insightful panels particularly on emissions trading and climate policy. Obviously, Dirk, there's been a lot of debate in the EU ETS about effectively the stalling of that system under the economic conditions of the EU. But perhaps you can say a little bit about what's happening there, but also a little bit about some of the indications and reasons for optimism in other jurisdictions, and the role of an organization like IETA in convening and driving thought leadership in this area.
Good. Thanks, James. And I'll try to do this in just a few short minutes to give you a little flavor of some of the things happening around the world on the mitigation side and mobilizing business in the solution side of this. But I'm glad to follow Janet on this because it is important to start with that understanding that it isn't an either or. We're going to end up doing mitigation and adaptation. But fundamentally, the longer we wait to mitigate, the more we're going to have to do on the adaptation side. And when you look at some of the numbers of what that can cost, it starts to make the mitigation thing look a lot more urgent. The longer you wait, the worse off you may be. So I think my members recognize that, by and large, because they're large strategic energy players typically, or service providers in the sector, that kind of take policymakers at their word that their intention long-term is to limit warming to no more than 2 degrees. And even at 2 degrees, we have to do a bunch of adaptation. But to get to that level of ambition, it means that we've got a sort of an emission budget to work with, according to scientists, of about 1 trillion tons over the period from 1750 to the end of this century. Sounds like a lot, doesn't it? 1 trillion tons? And so right now, I think we've cranked out about 550 million. So we've got plenty of headroom, and at the rate we're going to be fine until 2040. But that, theoretically, at the rate we're burning carbon, is when we hit the 1 trillionth ton. So I never thought I was actually going to live to see that moment, but it looks, closer and closer to me, and certainly is something that my kids would have to deal with in a serious way. If we mitigate earlier, we can use that budget a lot more wisely over time. So that's really what these emission trading programs are about, is creating an incentive-based system to gradually reduce emissions and manage that budget so that we can utilize the budget to the wisest extent possible. And it has been a rocky period in sort of the premier market of the EU emission trading program, but the rocky period has been because it was beset by a huge recession there that lowered emissions, and the market did what it was supposed to do. It adjusted to that lower amount of energy use and lower amount of industrial production. And some in the press would write about that as a huge collapse in the EU ETS. It failed because it acted like a market. And it adjusted to the new reality. The prices have been low. It's not driving a lot of new investment, but from the vantage point of industries covered by it, some of them view that as a really good thing because it's given them, during hard times, a lower cost of compliance. But it's also given them an opportunity to buy and bank and save those for a rainy day in the future. But there still is need for reform in the EU ETS. So earlier this year, looking out at the future and this kind of an emission trajectory that would be commensurate with that 2-degree ambition, the EU has announced that its plan is currently to reduce emissions to 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. They hadn't really told the business community what was going to be expected of them after that. So they announced their plans for 2030, which is a 40% reduction. And that's the first major target that a country has put on record. It'll be really interesting to see how Canada responds to that. What type of target does Canada put forward? What type of target does the US put forward? And over the course of the next year, we're going to see that. And we're also going to see what kind of target China and India and Brazil and a lot of other important players put forward. So what Europe has said is they're going to go to 40% domestically, and they might do more than that depending on whether there is a good international market opportunity to engage with others and to reduce in a market-based system globally. That's what my organization is pushing them on. We think that that's something that the international community needs to get serious about because it lowers the cost for everyone if we get the markets to connect up. So that's, I think, an important development, and another important development for Europe, in addition to giving some clarity about where business is going, is that they've set a little more clarity about what their intentions are for 2050, which is an 80% reduction, which means that the sectors covered by the emission trading system would probably do more than that. And it means a complete decarbonization of the power sector in Europe. This is in 30 countries in Europe by the 2050 time period. It's a huge amount of investment, but my suspicion is it's still cheaper than trying to pay to adapt. So for businesses, that creates a challenge, but it also creates an opportunity because, you know, we're working with an energy infrastructure, much of it that was built in the 60s and 70s, and now I get to build new stuff. And it'll be a lot more interesting, probably. It'll be lower carbon. It will be a type of an energy infrastructure that's got better security dimensions, perhaps, and things that can last us into a future that's a lot more sustainable. So the other thing I wanted to communicate, I guess, is that Europe's not willing to go it alone anymore. They're expecting others to live up to their share of the obligation. And so in hosting the Paris COP, the Conference of the Parties next year, which Christiana referred to in her remarks, they're expecting other countries to come forward with serious targets, including the developing world. And interestingly, the developing world is responding to that. And they're working on programs. And I think the most interesting one to watch right now is China, a place that we're quite active as an association, because they're adopting an emissions trading program for China, starting with a set of pilot programs. And in China, a pilot program isn't like a BC pilot program. It's massive. On China's scale, 2 provinces, 5 cities, and you add up the population of the emission trading programs they're developing, they will cover 250 million people. That's a pilot. Just one of those pilots, Guangdong, is about the size of Germany. So these are big, serious programs. I've worked some with the industries covered by them. They think they're serious. They're starting off gentle, but they're going to get tougher over time. And China's intention is to announce an emission trading program for the country in their next 5-year plan. We'll see exactly what the contours of that are, but it's a much different China than you see at a negotiating table in Vaughan in the lead up to the carbon talks, because it's a China that's action-oriented and a China that's also trying to solve local air pollution problems, and a China that recognizes that it's got a responsibility on the global stage. And it's not willing to do it alone either. So I commend to your reading, look at the World Bank's Partnership for Market Readiness program, which is, I think, one of the more interesting things out there, that is working with a number of countries, Mexico included, and Brazil, and Chile, South Africa. I think there are 17 different participants that are all working on carbon pricing programs. So in the question about, you know, is there time for delay, I started my career working in the political sphere in Washington on this issue in the Clinton administration. And one of the big issues was always about whether we're going it alone and whether anybody else is really going to do this. And that excuse is going away. That excuse is not going to be a valid excuse anymore. The other one is that it's going to cost too much, that we can't really afford it. So that's the one that I think that we really have to get honest about, and that policymakers need to get honest about, that when you say you aren't willing to pay for mitigation, you have just signed your people up to pay for Janet's piece of adaptation. So there's not a free lunch. You're going to either pay to mitigate or adapt. And my suspicion is that we'll all be a lot better off paying to mitigate and using market-based mechanisms to do it in the most cost-effective way possible. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a glimmer of good news that there's some good stuff happening out there. And frankly, it's a great place to be here in BC talking about that, because this is one of the continental leaders in North America on that program. So maybe we'll talk about that more in the Q&A.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dirk. Isabel, you've very kindly brought some slides to help us understand the pace and scope of change in Mexico. So many of us have heard some of the news around some of the proposed schemes and programs, but we all know that Mexico is the fastest moving of the South American, Central American countries in terms of climate action. So perhaps hand over to you to give us a quick tour of Mexico's climate policy.
Thank you very much, James. Well, we are part of North America since 1994, just to clear that out.
Exactly. I wasn't here then. I was still in England,
okay,
so you're happy.
Good. Well, it's just a couple of slides. In effect, I wanted to provide you some information about what is happening in Mexico in terms of climate change. As you may know, due to its location, Mexico is particularly vulnerable to climate change. We are in the middle of two oceans, and part of our territory is quite dry, and the southern part is the opposite. And so what we see is that this is a country that year after year is hit either by a drought or floodings or hurricanes, or whatever other effects of climate change. And although we do not have specific documentation of the costs, they are quite high. And especially because they are hitting sometimes, either populations or communities that are quite marginal, or either because they are hitting touristic centers that are very relevant, for the economy, or you see the affectation in key infrastructure, which is, by the sea. If we talk about, for instance, Tabasco, which is, a oil-producing location. So this largely explains why Mexico, even though it contributes less than 1.5% of GHG emissions at the global level, is moving very fast in designing the institutional framework to implement public policies and programs to deal with the impacts of climate change. So last year, Congress approved the General Climate Change Law and set the goals to reduce by a third in 2020 our emissions, GHG emissions, and by 50% in 2050. These are very quite ambitious goals, although I must say and emphasize they are aspirational, in as much as these goals depend on financing coming from international sources. So, but the country and the government is pretty serious about this. The law was actually the result of the decision made by the previous government, and the idea of making this a law, it was precisely to provide continuity to the policies and programs that were introduced in the last government, which I thought, I think it's great for the country, for a country that does not have really, a good record in terms of continuity of policies. So based on the law, and let me just change here, you can see some of the numbers I mentioned. Mexico has established a national system of climate change, which includes an interministerial commission on climate change, which is integrated by 13 ministries. This is a very relevant point. I've heard and we've seen of many other climate change programs that they may be introducing a few mitigation goals, to reduce emissions in transportations or, and utilities or the use of carbon. But I think here there is a real effort to have a very comprehensive policy to address the issue of climate change, which I think it's a very relevant point. It is not only about, how we look at one sector or another, but how we really restructure our institutional framework to deal with climate change in a more comprehensive way. The system also includes a climate change council, which is a permanent advisory board integrated by members of the social, academic, and the private sector that precisely provides advice, to the government. And so you have embedded here the interest of NGOs, of the academic sector, and of course the private sector that has a very key role in the implementation of many of the measures and programs established by this law. I will come back to this in a minute. The National System on Climate Change also includes the National Institute for the Ecology and Climate Change, and this institution provides, of course, the research, the analysis, and also develops the strategies, plans, and programs, not only for the federal government as such, but also for the municipal and state governments. The Institute also has as a responsibility to evaluate all the programs and these measures implemented by the federal government, which is a very important point, as we all know. You can do a lot of things, but if you don't measure them, most likely you're not going to have any progress made. Based on this national system, we also have the development of the National Climate Change Strategy that set both adaptation and mitigation goals with the perspective of 10, 20, and 40 years. This, I think, is very important, again, in terms of providing some continuity to the programs. I know this may not be a case in the developed world, but in the developing world, giving continuity to programs is a big issue because, as you have new governments coming, most likely, they are going to start over even if they introduce or continue with climate change plans. Most likely, they are going to be undoing whatever was achieved or progress achieved in the previous administration. I'd like just to highlight, this is, I think, a very thorough perspective on how to address climate change. I just want to emphasize a few points. In the adaptation side, there are at least three goals set that are very important in terms of something that Janet mentioned. It is the emphasis on the reduction of vulnerability by increasing resiliency. Resiliency is becoming a big issue, not only because of the direct cost associated with the impacts of climate change, but also the social cost. As I mentioned before, and as many of you know, Mexico is still dealing with a lot of issues in terms of addressing poverty and inequality. And most of the impacts that we see end up, creating problems in the poverty agenda that the country has to deal with. Of course, resiliency also means we need to invest more in adaptation for protecting strategic infrastructure, as I mentioned before. And another key goal for adaptation is, of course, conservation and the use of ecosystems. It's a very important part that needs to be connected to the other goals in terms of building resiliency in the system. Of course, in mitigation, one of the clear areas for opportunity is clean energy. This is very much linked to the energy reform going on in Mexico, although the emphasis has been on Pemex and the restructuring of Pemex and the hydrocarbon sector in general. I think there has been an emphasis also in the importance of promoting clean energy in Mexico as well. So that's one of the big goals for this long-term strategy in Mexico. Also, of course, improving energy, reducing energy intensity. And there are two other areas that I think are quite innovative. The first one, of course, is the issue of the reduction of short-use climate pollutants. There is a lot of debate always about, the importance of reducing carbon emissions, but there is little talk about, the opportunities in the short, middle term in terms of reducing methane, for instance, or black carbon. There is not as much of a debate, when you talk about these short-lived pollutants rather than, talking about carbon dioxide. So that's one of the important innovations here. And the other one is the emphasis on sustainable cities. And Mexico passed very quickly in the last 30 years from being more rural population to becoming an urban country, really, with a lot of opportunities to not have the megalopolis like we have in Mexico City, or even now a growing city like Guadalajara or Monterrey, but rather addressing the middle cities so that they become opportunities for business and for sustainability. Quickly, I'd like to show you just another important requirement and instrument from an institutional perspective that is mandatory by the Mexican climate change law, which is the National Emissions Registry for industry. This is very important because although there is already a voluntary program that is very much promoted and coordinated by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development based organization in Mexico, CESPEDES, the proposal is that the voluntary scheme that they have, which is already run on the methodologies of the GHG protocol from the World Reporting Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, that is used as the basis for the mandatory registry in Mexico. But this, together with the carbon tax that was just recently passed in Mexico this year, is creating the impetus really for trading emissions in the country and the opportunities to introduce a market system so that we have industry in Mexico participating in the global markets as well.
Great,
thank you.
If Canada and the US were looking for a coherent system, federal system for designing climate policy, I think we've just seen perhaps the best example in North America now in terms of what Mexico's committed to. Far more coherent system in some ways than Canada's been able to pull together, I think. So thanks, Isabel, for those insights. Scott.
Great. So I'll be about 4 minutes since I'm watching the time. So thanks. This is really, really interesting. I wanted to make one sort of high-level point, which is that policy really matters. If you look at if you go over next door and you look at the displays of technological innovation, looking at new solutions and clean energy, in a situation where we're lacking clear policy coherence. Imagine if you had that. Imagine if you had a global target, a North American target, and a Canadian target, which actually sets up clear directional clarity. And so within that, I just want to make a couple of points. So the first one is around what's happening within Canada. We did a report which summed up what's happening in Canada in 2013, and it's really, really incredibly interesting. We heard from the BC Premier this morning. The BC carbon tax has now become a global model that other countries, jurisdictions, and industries are looking at as a model. But also Alberta has a highly innovative, including a $15 per ton tax proxy, which has gone now into an innovation fund of about $340 million. Manitoba has introduced a new strategy, which is including both hydro as well as biofuels. Ontario is phasing out coal. Quebec has a cap-and-trade system, and you go down the list, and it's incredibly innovative. And I've forgotten one jurisdiction, and I wonder what that would be. Oh yeah, I live in Ottawa. It's Canada, the federal government. So when you say that delay is not an option, actually, this is not a political statement. That delay is a chosen option for the federal government that promised in 2012 a regulation for oil and gas industry. So it was supposed to come in 2012. It was then promised in the spring of 2013. Then it was deferred to the summer of 2013, then the fall of 2013. Here we are now in March 2014. and nobody knows where it is. And the Prime Minister late last year said it may be several years away. So you have to think about, well, why is that delayed? And let me just be very clear, it's certainly not because of the lack of competence, creativity, innovation, professionalism of the Federal Civil Service. It's because the government clearly has heard that they believe that introducing that regulation at that time is going to have an economic cost, which is going to outweigh the benefits, which is Dirk's point. But I think that every analyst and everyone around this table will know that the longer the delay, the higher the cost. Which then goes to the second thing I wanted to briefly mention, and this is the area of money. So there's two things from this. I think on the public policy side, we've been spending a lot of work on just a simple question of policy coherence in any complex mechanism in government. Does the right hand know what the left hand is doing? So if you look at the issue of energy subsidies that Isabel just raised, within Canada, just at the federal level, about $800 million is spent on subsidies to the oil and gas sector every year. And then there's others from the provinces. If you look at it then globally, the International Monetary Fund has said that there's almost $2 trillion in subsidies which are provided to the oil and gas sector, which is have direct correlation between emissions for GHG. So if you just imagine a world where that distortion, both from a sort of just prudent fiscal management perspective, as well as what the environmental benefits would be of getting at those subsidies, would be enormously huge. But then it goes to the broader issue, and that is we know that governments aren't going to be able to fund this. We know that this is a much larger issue, and it's a scalability issue. And where I'm hopeful on this is when we heard Jim Basile this morning, the work of the SDTC, I think it's incredibly impressive. It's about $1 billion. The CCMC of the Alberta Carbon Tax Fund is about $340 million. They're looking at promising new startup technologies. But we know that the magnitude of this issue, it far outruns the availability of essentially, which is project finance. So, one of the areas which I think is really hopeful, really innovative is in January of this year, among the largest banks, investments, Goldman Sachs and others, have said is they've now articulated what they've called the green bond principles, JP Morgan and others. And where that's really important, if you look at total project finance, it's about $350 billion a year. If you look at global capital markets, it runs into tens and tens of trillions of dollars a year. And so for me, this is a signal that the money in Wall Street and in London and others are at least potentially looking at this as a way of looking at it from a risk to an investment opportunity. And then the other example I wanted to give is China. And this is where I think things are really, really incredibly interesting. So we've been looking at now for 15 years trying to get, for example, the U.S. Security Exchange Commission, their counterparts in different countries, to look at climate risk in terms of materiality. And it hasn't really gone anywhere. It's produced lots of interesting analysis. But the China Regulatory Banking Commission in 2012 introduced, so it's the Regulatory Banking Commission, it's not an environmental protection ministry, they introduced a requirement in a 2012 green policy commitment, that a percentage of total bank liquidity now has to be directed to a green sector. So right now, at least according to the Central Bank of China, about 8% of total Chinese banking liquidity is now directed in some way in an environmental sector. And I hope that where China has provided leadership on this, others will follow. UNEP Financial Initiative is working on this, IISD is working on this, and others. So for me, this is an area of those two, if you put them together, that maybe you look at that scalability as going to be driven by private markets. And what I'll end with is just to underscore Dirk's point about carbon budgets. And so if you look at this issue now, I mean, clearly the science is now absolutely settled, but we know that societies don't change because scientists say we're now 98% certain that this is going to happen and the impacts are going to be dire. So I think what we need now to look at is what does this mean in terms of carbon budgets? And what it really means is what is the upper threshold or the planetary limit that we are now able to put into the atmosphere to keep within that 2 degrees Celsius. And even within that 2 degrees Celsius, this was the nightmare scenario 5 or 6 years ago. Now scientists in the United States, in an interagency analysis, which included, wildly left-wing radical ministries like the Pentagon, the Secretary of Commerce, and others, they're looking now at scenarios of 3 to 5 or 6 degrees. And 3 to 5 to 6 degrees are, I think this is now in a realm of an absolutely nightmarish scenario. And so for me, this issue of carbon budgets is it's not a scientific issue, it's not an ideological issue, it becomes a matter of arithmetic and how we actually now find out the smarts to actually meet within that budget.
That might be the first time the Pentagon's been described as a left-wing institution. Thanks, Scott. I'd like to come back to a question I raised at the beginning, which is that we had a lot of confidence and investment into the UNFCCC COP process over the years, and been consistently fairly disappointed, particularly in the recent rounds. The kind of low point, I think, in Warsaw was the firing of the Minister of Environment who was hosting it halfway through the conference. That was not a great signal to send from the Polish government. But what can we expect from the meetings in Lima and in Paris in the following year? A lot seems to be focused on Paris as really the milestone meeting. What should we expect from that, and what are each of your hopes about those meetings and expectations from what we can expect from these multilateral agreements when we've seen this kind of regional growth and expansion of climate programs? Janet, perhaps I could start with you.
Well, I think you've hit it right on the head. It's the regional expansion. So it's often described as a bottoms-up rather than a tops-down, and I wouldn't consider that a failure. Yeah. It's simply a different model. And the U.S. is very serious about trying to figure out what its contribution it's going to put on the table in the first quarter of 2015. There's a lot of private discussions that are going on. What target, what are they going to put on the table? I don't know. I would say, though, that this framework, this UNFCCC framework, is important because it keeps people talking, it keeps the conversation alive, and it gives people a reason for thinking about how these pieces fit together. And while I don't have huge expectations that we're going to come in with a global agreement anytime soon, I don't think that makes the process irrelevant.
Dirk, what's your perspective and IITA's perspective on COP in terms of...
So I think this year is a prep year. So Lima will aim to get texts on the table from different parties of what they're looking for in terms of the basic architecture and what the key elements of the negotiation are going to be for the following year. But it's not intended to be a big decisional COP. So next year, however, in Paris is the year that they should agree on the fundamentals. What I'm anticipating is that the big outcome in Paris is going to be one that you can read in one sitting. It'll be maybe 10 or 12 pages, but it'll be firm foundational stuff that sets out how commitments are going to work, which they're calling contributions now, and how the Green Climate Fund and climate finance play in it, and how adaptation strategies are going to play into it, and technology initiatives. So it'll have a bundle of things like that. And for those of us that are interested in market mechanisms, I think it's going to have some accounting principles of making sure that there aren't any double counting potentials, but that those are dealt with cleanly. But I actually think that the game for trading architecture may move to these other types of regional fora that are more coalitions of the willing. And I'm not sure that there's anything in this agreement that will be definitional in the sense that Kyoto did it, of giving a clean development mechanism that you kind of knew how that was going to operate. I think this is going to be more like, those of you that want to do trading, here's how you're going to have to account for it and report it, but you're free to go and do what you would like to do. So for us, that's actually a real opportunity, because it maybe breaks it out of a group of, it's not a great decisional body. They don't move with the speed of light or anything. So maybe it moves it to fora that can move more quickly and are the people who really want to do it. And so I'm kind of encouraged by that, frankly. I still think there'll be a role for the UNFCCC, but I think that's what the agreement looks like.
Isabel, in addition to thinking about the UNFCCC, we know there's been a fair amount of negotiation between California, Mexico, and Brazil around the linking and connection between schemes. How important is that multilateralism to Mexico's agenda, and how important is the UNFCCC process to the Mexican federal agenda that you laid out?
Well, as you know, for Mexico, the multilateral negotiations were critical. I mean, Mexico had a leading role in Cancun, and I think Mexico's engagement is, or whatever we have done domestically, is a bit a result of that leadership and how much Mexico was really committed to addressing climate change. I think that multilateralism is, it's good in itself. It's a value, but I think that it depends. I mean, the success that we see in the global negotiations depends on so many other factors. Like, what's the state of the economy in general? I don't see that there is, an impetus on the part of the U.S. or Canada, or even Europe to seriously address the issue of emissions, because we know what does that mean for these countries. I mean, especially in terms of making a real commitment in terms of money for the Green Fund, which is very much expected by the developing world. So that's, I think, a critical issue. In terms of, for Mexico, how we see the linking with other trading schemes, I think it's very important. And I think the role of emerging economies is going to be the critical variable for Paris and Lima. And this is so because, in as much as these countries can present climate change as an opportunity and not as a barrier to growth, then I think we can move forward. I think Mexico is setting an example, in terms of how climate change could become really an opportunity to be more competitive, to have the institutional framework in place to move ahead and especially invest in special key sectors that could become the drivers of the economy. Because of time, I couldn't mention the fact that the present government is seeing climate change as an instrument of green growth. There is a bigger strategy in terms of big growth and how climate change and the law and the institutional framework could be the basis really to promote green industry in Mexico and a number of programs that could actually generate jobs by including sustainability as a broader goal.
Scott, last comments perhaps to you, and maybe to ask you to reflect a little bit on the extent to which Canadian domestic politics might be influenced by a range of different pressure points around climate policy. We are moving into the very early stages or discussions around what various different federal platforms are going to look like around climate policy. We've had a government that's been much more domestically focused than has been traditionally in Canada. What do you see as some of the pressure points that might shape and influence Canadian policy in particular over the next 2 or 3 years? And is the COP process even relevant at this stage?
I mean, last first. I mean, I certainly think the COP process is absolutely relevant to every country, and I think it's back to this issue of having coherence. And I agree. I think Dirk's take on it is I think my colleagues in IISD follow these negotiations religiously. I think that if you think about the state of multilateral negotiations in any fora, so think about the international trade regime, and you think about how many times the Doha round has been missed, and so I think part of this is a reflection of just multilateralism right now is not in a terribly strong state. But then you have examples under that wide, sort of the broader umbrella, and short-lived climate pollutants would be one. So there's an initiative of CCAC, which is a coalition of countries which is smaller, which has made commitments. Canada is one of those. It was actually the founding of that, and black carbon and HFCs and flaring from oil and gas. They're actually now making measurable commitments with money and measuring then the impacts of those. In terms then of, right now, to what extent does the UN negotiations affect Canada's policy, at least within Ottawa? my guess would be almost not at all. But what I do think is, since we all know that we're connected, one of the biggest sort of visual connections with our largest trading partner is Keystone XL. And so if you look at that as being that's far beyond the pipeline, it's become symbolic of a whole bunch of other issues. And so that is one example where bilateral pressure around climate issues will certainly affect to some extent Canada's agenda. But it'll look, I think, quite different 2 years from now.
Okay, great. I know it's always very dangerous when a moderator doesn't allow questions from the audience, because the exits are the back of the room and we have to get past all of you. I'd invite those of you that have questions to come to the front and speak to each of the presenters directly. I think this has been a fascinating, quick tour of the various different policy regimes in North America and around the world, with some great examples and definitely some food for thought. I'd like to leave you with the sense that the title of this session was a provocation. It doesn't seem to me like delay is an option in any way, or is even something that's necessarily being implemented or seen in the evidence that we've heard from today. And I'd also like to ask you to join me in thanking all of the speakers for their insights. Thank you.